The moving truck groaned as it lumbered to a stop in front of the Victorian house. Mark squinted, shielding his eyes from the late afternoon sun. It was bigger than he remembered, even more decrepit. Paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and the porch sagged like a weary smile. But the price was right, practically a steal. And after losing Sarah, his wife and Lily's mother, they needed a steal. They needed a fresh start, a place to rebuild their lives, even if it was in a house that looked like it belonged in a ghost story. "Wow, Daddy! It's like a castle!" Lily exclaimed, her 6-year-old eyes wide with wonder. Her enthusiasm was a balm to Mark's weary soul. Maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all. He helped her out of the truck. "It is a bit like a castle, isn't it? Our castle." He forced a smile, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. The inside was even more daunting. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through grimy windows. The air hung heavy with the scent of mildew and forgotten things. Cobwebs draped like ghostly curtains from the ornate, but crumbling, ceilings. Mark rolled up his sleeves. "All right, Princess, let's claim our kingdom." The first few days were a flurry of unpacking, cleaning, and trying to make the cavernous house feel like a home. Lily, bless her heart, was surprisingly helpful, carrying boxes half her size and chattering about everything she saw. Mark tried to focus on the task at hand, pushing back the grief that threatened to engulf him. One afternoon, as Mark was wrestling with a stubborn windowpane, he heard Lily talking. "Hello. Are you in there?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly. Mark glanced around. "Lily, who are you talking to?" She pointed to one of the old, cast-iron heating vents in the floor. "The man in the wall." Mark chuckled. "There's no man in the wall, sweetie. You're just imagining things." Lily shook her head, her brow furrowed. "No, he's there. He says his name is Arthur." Mark sighed. Imaginary friends. Perfectly normal, he supposed, especially for a child who had been through so much. He'd play along for now. "Well, what does Arthur want?" "He wants to play," Lily said, then skipped off to explore another room, leaving Mark to his windowpane and a growing unease he couldn't quite explain. He chalked it up to the stress of the move and the overwhelming feeling of being alone in this old house with only his daughter and the ghosts of his memories. It would get better, he told himself. It had to. They just needed time to settle in, to make this house a home, to chase away the shadows and the whispers that seemed to cling to the very walls. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, a feeling that something wasn't quite right, that the house held secrets darker than just dust and cobwebs. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Mark would spend his days repairing the house, patching holes in the walls, replacing broken windows, and generally trying to make the place habitable. Lily, meanwhile, spent more and more time talking to Arthur. At first, Mark found it almost endearing. A child's imagination was a wonderful thing, a defense against the harsh realities of the world. But as the days passed, Lily's conversations became different. He'd often find her sitting by the vent, her small face tilted towards it, listening intently. Her responses were often cryptic and unsettling. "No, I don't want to play hide-and-seek in the dark," she'd say, her voice barely a whisper. Or, "He says he doesn't like the sunshine." Mark tried to engage her in other activities, to distract her from her imaginary friend. He took her to the park, read her stories, and even attempted to teach her how to play baseball in the overgrown backyard. But Lily's mind seemed to be elsewhere, always drifting back to Arthur. One evening, as Mark was making dinner, Lily came into the kitchen, her eyes wide with a strange mixture of excitement and fear. "Daddy," she said, tugging on his shirt, "Arthur wants me to come visit him." Mark knelt down, taking her small hands in his. "Visit him? Where does he live?" "In the walls," Lily replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He says there's a secret door." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Lily, there's no secret door. Arthur is just a pretend friend. You can talk to him, but you can't actually go anywhere with him. Okay. Lily nodded, but Mark could see the disappointment in her eyes. He ruffled her hair and tried to sound cheerful. How about we watch a movie tonight? We can make popcorn and build a fort in the living room. Lily's face brightened, and Mark breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was just a phase. But as he tucked her into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He found himself staring at the heating vent in her room, listening for any sound, any sign of the mysterious Arthur. The house was silent, except for the creaks and groans of an old house settling, but to Mark's ears, it sounded like whispers, like secrets being shared in the darkness. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just dismiss Lily's imaginary friend any longer. He had to find out who, or what, Arthur really was. He decided he would investigate the vents, maybe even call a specialist to check the house. He needed to protect Lily. He just hoped he wasn't already too late. That night, sleep evaded Mark. He tossed and turned, the image of Lily's wide, innocent eyes filled with a strange, unsettling knowledge burned into his mind. The house seemed to amplify his anxiety, every creak and groan a reminder of its age and the secrets it held. He finally got out of bed, deciding a thorough search of the vents was in order. Armed with a flashlight and a screwdriver, he started in Lily's room. The vent cover was old and rusty, the screws practically fused in place. After a struggle, he managed to pry it open. The flashlight beam revealed a dark, dusty tunnel, barely wide enough for a small child to crawl through. The air inside was stale and musty, carrying a faint, earthy smell. He moved on to the other vents in the house, each one revealing the same dark, narrow passage. He found nothing, no sign of another person, no evidence of Lily having been inside. Just dust, cobwebs, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. But the search wasn't entirely fruitless. In the living room, near the base of the vent, he noticed something odd, a small, intricately carved wooden toy soldier, half buried in the dust. It looked old, antique even. It certainly wasn't one of Lily's toys. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was strangely unsettling, its painted eyes seeming to follow him. As he examined the toy soldier, he heard a faint whisper, seemingly coming from the walls themselves. It was barely audible, a low, sibilant sound that sent shivers down his spine. He strained his ears, trying to decipher the words, but it was just a murmur, a collection of indistinct sounds. He dismissed it as his imagination, fueled by exhaustion and paranoia. But then, a picture frame fell off the wall in the hallway, shattering on the floor. Mark jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He cautiously approached the broken frame, his flashlight beam dancing across the wall. That's when he saw it, a dark, shadowy figure lurking in the corner of the hallway, just at the edge of his vision. He blinked, and it was gone. Mark stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. He was no longer sure what to believe. Was he imagining things? Was he hallucinating from lack of sleep? Or was something truly sinister happening in this house? He decided to call a contractor in the morning, someone who could inspect the house properly, check the structural integrity, and maybe even offer some explanation for the strange occurrences. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something else was sharing their home, something that was preying on Lily's innocence and his own grief. He clutched the wooden toy soldier tightly in his hand, a tangible reminder that something was amiss, that the whispers and shadows were more than just tricks of the light and echoes of the past. He had to protect Lily, no matter what it took. He just hoped he could figure out what he was protecting her from before it was too late. The contractor, a burly man named Dave, arrived the next morning. Mark showed him around the house, pointing out the cracks in the foundation, the sagging floors, and the general state of disrepair. He also mentioned the strange occurrences, the whispers, and the shadowy figure, but Dave just chuckled. "Old houses are full of surprises, pal," he said, patting Mark on the back. "They settle, they creak, they play tricks on your mind. Especially when you're already stressed out. Mark wanted to believe him, to dismiss everything as his imagination running wild. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was truly wrong. Dave spent the day inspecting the house, poking and prodding, taking measurements, and making notes. He found nothing out of the ordinary, no structural issues that would explain the strange noises or the cold spots that seemed to appear and disappear at random. "The house is solid, just old," he said when he was finished. "Needs some work, sure, but nothing to worry about. As for the noises, probably just the wind whistling through the cracks." Mark paid him and thanked him for his time, but he felt no relief. Dave's explanations felt hollow, inadequate. He was still alone in this house with Lily, and whatever was lurking in the shadows was still there, watching, waiting. The strange occurrences continued to escalate. Objects would move slightly, a book falling off a shelf, a chair rocking gently back and forth, a door creaking open on its own. The whispers became more frequent, more distinct, sometimes sounding like Lily's name being called in a low, breathy voice. One evening, as Mark was reading Lily a bedtime story, the temperature in her room suddenly dropped. A wave of icy air washed over them, raising goosebumps on their skin. Lily shivered and clung to Mark, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy, it's cold," she whispered. "Arthur doesn't like it when you read stories." Mark wrapped his arms around her, trying to reassure her, but his own heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the cold, too, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He slammed the book shut and pulled the covers up to Lily's chin. "That's enough stories for tonight," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Let's get you to sleep." He stayed in her room until she drifted off, his eyes darting nervously around the room, searching for any sign of the shadowy figure or the source of the cold. He saw nothing, but he could feel its presence, a dark, malevolent energy that seemed to permeate the very air. As he left the room, he noticed something on the floor near the vent, the wooden toy soldier he had found the other day. He hadn't put it there. He was sure of it. He picked it up, his fingers trembling. The toy soldier's painted eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, mocking him. He knew then that he was no longer in control, that something else was calling the shots in this house. And he feared for Lily's safety, and his own. In the days that followed, Lily's behavior changed dramatically. She became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours alone in her room, her door closed. She ate less, slept poorly, and seemed to jump at every shadow and every sound. Her bright, cheerful personality, which had been a beacon of hope for Mark after Sarah's death, seemed to dim with each passing day. Her conversations with Arthur became more frequent and more intense. Mark would often overhear her talking in hushed tones, her voice barely audible. He couldn't make out the words, but he could sense the urgency and the fear in her voice. He tried to talk to her, to find out what was going on, but she would just clam up, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "It's nothing, Daddy," she'd say, her voice small and tight. "I'm just playing." But Mark knew she wasn't just playing. Something was happening to Lily, something that was changing her, and he was powerless to stop it. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the vent in her room, her face pale and drawn. She was clutching the wooden toy soldier tightly in her hand, her eyes fixed on the vent. "Lily, what are you doing?" Mark asked, his voice gentle. She didn't respond. He knelt down beside her and touched her arm. She flinched, as if he had startled her. "Lily, please talk to me," he pleaded. "What's wrong?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Arthur says he's lonely," she whispered. "He wants me to stay with him." Mark's blood ran cold. "Stay with him? Where?" "In the walls," she replied, her voice barely audible. "He says there's a special place, a secret room. He says we can play games and have fun." Mark pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "Lily, you can't go anywhere with Arthur. He's not real. He's just a pretend friend. She shook her head, her eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and fascination. He is real, Daddy. I've seen him. He's right there, behind the wall. Mark stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the wall, at the vent, at the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. He saw nothing, but he could feel Arthur's presence, a dark, malevolent force that was slowly consuming his daughter. He knew he had to do something drastic. He couldn't let Arthur take Lily away. He had to find a way to break the connection, to sever the hold that this imaginary friend had on his daughter. He just didn't know how. He thought about taking Lily away, moving to a new house, a new town, anywhere to escape the influence of this place. But he knew that Arthur wasn't just in the house. He was in Lily's mind. And he feared that even if they left, Arthur would follow them, clinging to Lily like a shadow, waiting for the opportunity to strike again. Mark didn't sleep well that night. He kept waking up, his heart pounding, convinced that he had heard something, a whisper, a creak, a rustle in the walls. Each time, he would get out of bed and check on Lily, making sure she was safe and sound. Around 3 a.m., he woke up again, this time with a feeling of dread so intense it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He stumbled out of bed and rushed to Lily's room. The room was dark and silent. The only light came from the moon filtering through the grimy window panes, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he approached Lily's bed. It was empty. The blankets were neatly folded, as if she had made the bed herself. The wooden toy soldier lay on the pillow, its painted eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "Lily?" Mark called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He frantically searched the room, checking under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. But Lily was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through him, a tidal wave of fear that threatened to drown him. He ran out of the room and into the hallway, calling Lily's name. "Lily! Lily, where are you?" The house remained silent, except for a faint whispering sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was barely audible, a low, sibilant murmur that sent shivers down his spine. He strained his ears, trying to decipher the words, but it was just a jumble of indistinct sounds. Then, he heard it, a single word, repeated over and over again, carried on the breath of the wind. "Lily! Lily! Lily!" Mark's blood ran cold. He knew then that Arthur had taken her. He had lured her into the walls, into his secret place, and now she was gone. He stumbled back into Lily's room, his mind reeling. He had to find her. He had to get her back. But where do you look for someone who has vanished into thin air, someone who has been swallowed by the walls themselves? He knelt down beside the vent, his hand trembling as he reached out and touched the cold, cast-iron surface. He closed his eyes and listened, straining to hear any sound, any sign of Lily. All he heard was the whispering, the faint, ghostly murmur that seemed to mock his despair. He was alone. And Lily was gone. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was running out of time. He had to find her, before it was too late. Before Arthur claimed her completely. Before she disappeared forever into the darkness of the walls. Driven by a desperate surge of adrenaline, Mark began a frantic search of the house. He tore through every room, ripping open closets, overturning furniture, and peering into every nook and cranny. He checked the basement, a damp, musty space filled with cobwebs and forgotten relics of the past. He searched the attic, a sweltering, dusty space filled with broken furniture and the ghosts of memories. He found nothing. No sign of Lily, no sign of Arthur, just the unsettling silence of the old house and the faint, persistent whispering that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He started to feel a sense of despair creeping in, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate him. He couldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. He had to find Lily, no matter what it took. He returned to Lily's room, his mind racing, trying to think of where she could be, where Arthur could have taken her. He stared at the walls, at the vent, at the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. Then, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a slight discoloration in the wallpaper near the vent. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He approached the wall and ran his hand along the surface. He felt a slight give, a softness that didn't match the rest of the wall. He pressed harder, and the wallpaper seemed to sink in slightly. He pushed harder still, and a section of the wall panel popped inward with a soft click. He pulled on the panel, and it swung open, revealing a dark, narrow opening behind the wall. His heart leaped into his throat. This was it. This was Arthur's secret place. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the opening. The beam revealed a narrow, dusty passage that led into the darkness. The air inside was stale and musty, carrying a faint, earthy smell. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. What was waiting for him in there? What kind of horrors would he find? But he didn't have a choice. He had to go in. He had to find Lily. He took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The passage was narrow and cramped, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. The walls were rough and uneven, lined with cobwebs and dust. He moved forward cautiously, his senses on high alert, listening for any sound, any sign of Lily. The whispering seemed to intensify as he moved deeper into the passage, growing louder and more distinct. He could hear it now, the faint murmur of voices, the sound of children laughing, the rustling of clothes. He was getting closer. He was almost there. He just had to keep going. He had to find Lily, before it was too late. The passage twisted and turned, snaking through the walls of the old house like a dark, secret artery. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, drawing Mark deeper into the labyrinthine depths. Finally, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. Mark swept his flashlight around the room, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The chamber was empty. His breath caught in his throat, and his hope plummeted. He had been so sure that he would find Lily here, that this was where Arthur had taken her. But there was nothing. He took a step into the room, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The chamber was small, barely 10 feet in diameter. The walls were made of rough, unfinished stone, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust. Then, he saw them. In the center of the room, on the cold, stone floor, were Lily's shoes, her favorite pair of bright red sneakers. They were neatly placed side by side, as if she had taken them off and left them there. Mark rushed to the shoes, his heart aching with grief and despair. He picked them up, clutching them to his chest. They were small and light, but they felt like the heaviest things in the world. He looked around the room again, his flashlight beam searching for any other sign of Lily. And then he saw them, the drawings. They were scrawled on the walls of the chamber, childlike drawings done in crayon. There were drawings of flowers, of trees, of houses with smiling faces in the windows. But there were also other drawings, darker drawings, more disturbing drawings. There were drawings of a girl with long hair, standing in a dark forest. There were drawings of a shadowy figure lurking behind the trees, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. There were drawings of the girl reaching out to the shadowy figure, her face a mixture of fear and fascination. And then there was one drawing that made Mark's blood run cold. It was a drawing of a girl with long hair, lying on the floor of a small, circular chamber. Standing over her was the shadowy figure, its arms outstretched, its face obscured by darkness. Mark stared at the drawing, his mind reeling. He recognized the girl. It was Lily. And he recognized the chamber. It was this chamber. He dropped the shoes and stumbled back against the wall, his legs trembling. He knew then that Arthur wasn't just an imaginary friend. He was something else, something darker, something more sinister. And he had taken Lily. But where had he taken her? Where was she now? Was she still alive? Mark didn't know. All he knew was that he had to find her, before it was too late. He had to find her, even if it meant facing the darkness himself. Mark called the police, his voice trembling with fear and desperation. Within hours, the house was swarming with officers, their faces grim and professional. They searched every room, every closet, every corner, just as Mark had done, but they found nothing. They interviewed Mark, asking him questions about Lily, about her friends, about her recent behavior. They asked him about Sarah, about her death, about how he was coping. Mark answered their questions as best he could, but he could tell that they didn't believe him. They saw him as a grieving father, possibly unstable, possibly imagining things. When he told them about Arthur, about the whispers, about the shadowy figure, they exchanged glances, their expressions skeptical. When he showed them the hidden chamber, they seemed more interested in the structural integrity of the house than in the implications of the secret room. She probably ran away, one of the officers said, a young man with a tired face. Kids do it all the time. Especially after something traumatic like losing a parent. No, Mark said, his voice rising. She didn't run away. Arthur took her. He's in the walls. He's in the house. He pointed to the drawings on the wall, the drawings of Lily and the shadowy figure. Look at these. She drew these. This is what happened to her. The officers examined the drawings, but they seemed unmoved. These are just childish drawings, one of them said. Kids have active imaginations. But what about the whispers? Mark pleaded. Didn't you hear them? The house is whispering her name. The officers shook their heads. We didn't hear anything, sir. This house is old. It makes noises. Mark felt a surge of anger and frustration. They didn't believe him. They didn't understand. They thought he was crazy. You have to believe me, he said, his voice cracking. My daughter is in danger. You have to help me find her. The officers promised to do everything they could, but Mark could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought Lily had run away. They thought she was probably hiding somewhere, scared and confused. They thought she would turn up eventually. But Mark knew better. He knew that Lily hadn't run away. He knew that she hadn't just disappeared. He knew that Arthur had taken her, and that she was in grave danger. And he knew that if he wanted to find her, he would have to do it himself. Because the police weren't going to help him. They didn't believe him. They didn't understand. And they didn't care. All that mattered to them was closing the case, marking it as a runaway, and moving on to the next one. But Mark wouldn't let them. He wouldn't let them give up on Lily. He would find her, no matter what it took. He would find her, even if it meant facing the darkness alone. He would find her, even if it meant destroying the house, brick by brick, until he uncovered every secret it held. He would find Lily. He had to. He was her father. And he wasn't going to let her down. Not again. Flashback. Sarah's laughter echoed through the park as she pushed Lily on the swing. Sunlight glinted off her auburn hair, and her eyes sparkled with joy. Mark watched them from a nearby bench, a feeling of contentment washing over him. They were a family, a perfect little unit, bound together by love and laughter. End flashback. That memory, so vivid, so precious, was a knife twisting in Mark's gut. He had failed Sarah. He hadn't been able to save her. And now, he was failing Lily. Flashback. The hospital room was sterile and cold, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic. Sarah lay in bed, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes dull with pain. Mark held her hand, his heart breaking with every shallow breath she took. "Don't worry, my love," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're going to get better. You're going to come home." But he knew she wasn't going to get better. He knew she wasn't going to come home. He was just trying to hold on to hope, to deny the inevitable. End flashback. Denial. That's what it had been. Denial that Sarah was dying. Denial that Lily was talking to an imaginary friend. Denial that something sinister was happening in the old house. Flashback. The funeral was a blur of tears and grief. Mark stood beside Lily, his arm around her small shoulders, trying to shield her from the pain. But there was no shielding her. The pain was too great, too overwhelming. Afterward, Lily had clung to him, her face buried in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. "Mommy's gone, Daddy," she had cried. "She's never coming back." Mark had held her tight, his own tears streaming down his face. "I know, baby," he had said. "I know. But we'll be okay. We'll get through this together." End flashback. Had he really believed that? Had he really thought they could get through it together? Or was that just another lie he had told himself, another attempt to deny the pain? He had tried to be strong for Lily, to be the father she needed, but he had been so consumed by his own grief, so lost in his own pain, that he had failed to see what was happening to her. He had dismissed her imaginary friend, ignored the whispers, and brushed aside the strange occurrences. He had been too focused on his own suffering to notice that Lily was suffering too. And now, she was gone. Taken by something he couldn't understand, something he couldn't fight. And it was all his fault. He had failed Sarah. And now, he had failed Lily. He was a failure as a husband, a failure as a father. He was a failure as a human being. But he couldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. He owed it to Sarah. He owed it to Lily. He had to find her. He had to save her. Even if it meant facing his own demons, even if it meant confronting the darkness that had consumed his life. He had to find Lily. He had to bring her home. He had to. For Sarah. For Lily. For himself. Days turned into nights, and nights turned into days. Mark barely slept, barely ate, barely moved from the house. He was consumed by a single, all-encompassing obsession, finding Lily. He spent his days and nights listening to the walls, pressing his ear against the cold, plaster surfaces, straining to hear any sound, any sign of his daughter. He talked to the walls, whispering Lily's name, begging Arthur to bring her back. He became convinced that the walls held the key to Lily's disappearance, that they were somehow alive, that they were communicating with him, leading him on a twisted, macabre treasure hunt. He tore apart the house, piece by piece, searching for hidden passages, secret rooms, anything that might lead him to Lily. He ripped down wallpaper, tore up floorboards, and smashed through walls, his hands bleeding, his body aching, his mind teetering on the brink of madness. He found nothing. Just dust, cobwebs, and the unsettling silence of the old house. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, sometimes sounding like Lily's voice, sometimes sounding like Arthur's, sometimes sounding like a chorus of voices, all murmuring and chanting in a language he couldn't understand. He tried to communicate with whatever was in the walls, asking questions, making pleas, offering bargains. He tried to reason with Arthur, to appeal to his humanity, to convince him to release Lily. But Arthur remained silent, his presence a dark, malevolent force that seemed to mock Mark's despair. Mark started to lose track of time, to lose his grip on reality. He became gaunt and disheveled, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. He stopped shaving, stopped showering, stopped caring about anything except finding Lily. He was losing himself in the house, becoming one with the walls, becoming another ghost trapped within its decaying embrace. One night, as he was sitting in the hidden chamber, staring at the drawings on the wall, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from behind the wall. He jumped up, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed his ear against the wall, straining to hear. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then, he heard a voice, a small, weak voice, barely audible above the whispering. "Daddy," the voice said. "Daddy, is that you?" Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was Lily. "Lily," he cried out, his voice trembling. Lily, is that really you? Yes, Daddy, the voice said. I'm here. I'm in the wall. Mark's heart leaped with joy. He had found her. He had finally found her. Lily, where are you? He asked. Tell me how to get to you. I don't know, Daddy, the voice said. It's dark. I'm scared. It's okay, baby, Mark said, his voice soothing. I'm coming to get you. Just hold on. I'm coming. He grabbed his hammer and began to smash at the wall, his arms flailing wildly, his mind filled with a desperate hope. He was going to save Lily. He was going to bring her home. He was going to be the father she needed. He just had to break through the wall. He just had to reach her. He just had to save her. But was it really Lily? Or was it just another trick of the house, another cruel illusion designed to torment him, to drive him further into madness? He didn't know. But he didn't care. He had to try. He had to believe. Because if he didn't, he had nothing left. Mark swung the hammer with renewed ferocity, splintering the wood and cracking the plaster. He had to reach Lily. He had to save her. But the voice had fallen silent. The scratching had stopped. The whispering had intensified, swirling around him like a vortex of madness. He kept smashing, his arms aching, his breath ragged, his mind consumed by a single thought, Lily. Finally, the wall gave way, crumbling inward with a shower of dust and debris. Mark stumbled forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He saw nothing. Just another wall, another layer of plaster and wood, another barrier separating him from his daughter. His heart sank. He had been tricked. It hadn't been Lily. It had been Arthur, or whatever malevolent force was lurking in the walls, playing with his mind, toying with his emotions. He sank to his knees, his body trembling, his spirit broken. He had failed. He had failed Lily. He had failed Sarah. He had failed himself. He sat there for hours, lost in despair, the whispering swirling around him, mocking his grief. He was alone, trapped in the darkness, consumed by guilt and regret. Then, slowly, a new thought began to form in his mind. If Arthur had lured Lily into the walls by pretending to be her friend, then maybe he could lure Arthur out by pretending to be Lily. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all he had left. He stood up, his body stiff and aching, his mind focused on his new plan. He walked over to the vent, the same vent that Lily had used to talk to Arthur. He knelt down and pressed his ear against the cold, cast-iron surface. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice trembling, trying to imitate Lily's innocent tone. "Arthur? Are you there?" The house remained silent, except for the whispering, which seemed to grow louder, more curious. He tried again, his voice a little louder, a little more confident. "Arthur, it's me, Lily. I'm lonely. Will you come play with me?" He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath held captive in his lungs. Then, he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from behind the wall. His hope surged, a flicker of light in the darkness. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is that you?" The scratching stopped. The house remained silent. Then, a voice, a low, raspy voice, a voice that sent shivers down Mark's spine, spoke from behind the wall. "Lily," the voice said. "Is that really you?" Mark took a deep breath, his body trembling. He had done it. He had lured Arthur out. Now, he just had to figure out how to catch him. And how to save his daughter. If she was even still alive. "Yes, Arthur," Mark said, his voice mimicking Lily's. "It's me. Will you come out and play with me?" The raspy voice sent a chill down Mark's spine, but he held his ground, his mind racing, trying to formulate a plan. He had to keep Arthur talking, had to keep him engaged, while he figured out how to save Lily. "Yes, Arthur, it's me," Mark said, his voice trembling, trying to maintain the illusion of being Lily. "I'm all alone. Will you come play with me?" There was a long pause, a silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath held captive in his lungs. Then, Arthur spoke again, his voice low and menacing. "Where are you, Lily?" Mark hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to say. He couldn't reveal his location, couldn't give Arthur any advantage. I'm in my room," he said, his voice trembling. "By the vent." "I can't see you, Lily," Arthur said. "Come closer." Mark knew he was walking into a trap, but he didn't have a choice. He had to play along. He stood up and took a step towards the vent, his body trembling. "I'm here, Arthur," he said. "Can you see me now?" "No," Arthur said. "Come closer. I want to see your face." Mark took another step, closing the distance between himself and the vent. He could feel Arthur's presence, a dark, malevolent energy that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. As he stood there, listening to Arthur's voice, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A small, leather-bound book, half hidden beneath a pile of debris in the corner of the room. He had searched this room countless times, had torn it apart piece by piece, but he had never seen the book before. It was as if it had materialized out of thin air. He glanced at the vent, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to lose Arthur's attention, not even for a second. "Arthur, are you there?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Can you see me now?" "Almost," Arthur said. "Just a little closer, Lily. Just a little closer." Mark took another step, reaching the vent. He was so close now, he could almost feel Arthur's breath on his face. "I'm here, Arthur," he said, his voice barely audible. "Can you see me now?" "Yes," Arthur said, his voice low and menacing. "I can see you now, Lily." Mark held his breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. Then, he reached down and grabbed the book, his fingers closing around the worn leather cover. He didn't know what it was. But he hoped it would provide some answers, some clue to help him save Lily. "What do you want to play, Lily?" Arthur asked, his voice sounding closer now, almost as if he were standing right behind the wall. Mark ignored him, his fingers fumbling with the clasp of the book. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the faded, handwritten pages. The book was a journal, written by a former resident of the house, a woman named Eleanor who had lived there over a century ago. Her handwriting was elegant and flowing, but her words were filled with a chilling sense of dread. As Mark read, he began to understand the true nature of the evil that lurked within the walls of the old house. Eleanor wrote about a presence, an entity that fed on loneliness and grief, that preyed on the vulnerable and the heartbroken. She described how the entity would whisper to its victims, luring them into the walls with promises of friendship and companionship. She wrote about children disappearing, about families being torn apart, about the house becoming a prison for lost souls. And then, Mark read something that made his blood run cold. Eleanor wrote about her own daughter, a little girl named Alice, who had also disappeared into the walls, lured away by the entity. Eleanor had spent the rest of her life searching for Alice, tearing apart the house, just as Mark was doing now. But she had never found her. She had died alone and heartbroken, her spirit trapped within the walls of the house, forever searching for her lost child. Mark realized then that he was not the first victim of this entity. He was just the latest in a long line of grieving parents who had been lured into the house, their pain and loneliness exploited for the entity's gain. He had been a perfect target, a grieving widower, desperate for a fresh start, vulnerable and alone. He had unknowingly walked right into the entity's trap, bringing Lily with him. And now, Lily was gone, just like Alice, just like all the other children who had disappeared into the walls. Mark slammed the book shut, his heart pounding with rage and despair. He knew now what he was up against. He knew that he was facing something ancient and evil, something that had been preying on the innocent for centuries. "Lily, why aren't you talking?" Arthur asked, his voice impatient. Are you still there? Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had to find a way to defeat this entity, to save Lily, to break the cycle of pain and suffering that had haunted this house for so long. He just didn't know how. But as he stood there, staring at the journal, listening to Arthur's voice, a sense of resignation washed over him. He was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of grieving, tired of being alone. He had tried to save Lily, but he had failed. Just as he had failed Sarah. He was destined to lose the people he loved, to be forever haunted by their memory. Maybe it was time to give up. Maybe it was time to surrender to the darkness, to let the entity claim him, to join Lily in the walls. He closed his eyes, picturing Lily's face, her bright smile, her innocent eyes. He missed her so much. He missed Sarah so much. He just wanted to be with them again, to be a family again. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm ready. Take me." The whispering intensified, swirling around him like a comforting embrace. He could feel the entity's presence, a dark, seductive force that was promising him peace, promising him reunion, promising him an end to his suffering. He opened his eyes and looked at the vent. The darkness behind the wall seemed to beckon him, to draw him in, to offer him solace. He took a step towards the vent, his body moving as if under a spell. He was ready to surrender, to let go, to become another ghost trapped within the walls of the old house. But then, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A small, red sneaker, lying on the floor near the vent. It was Lily's sneaker, the one she had been wearing the night she disappeared. He had searched the entire house, had torn it apart piece by piece, but he had never found it. He picked up the sneaker, his fingers trembling. It was small and light, but it felt like a lifeline, a reminder of the love he had for Lily, a reason to keep fighting. He looked at the vent, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to let the entity win. He was going to save Lily, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He took a deep breath and spoke to the vent, his voice clear and strong. "Arthur, I know what you are. I know what you've done. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." The whispering stopped. The house fell silent. Then, a voice, a cold, menacing voice, spoke from behind the wall. "You can't.